Okay, so here we are. We are reading the Interactions Among Living Things homework assignment. Just like always, it's really helpful to take a look here at the guide for reading. If you take a look at these questions, often they also list out vocabulary. I don't see them doing that in this one. Um, Doing so can really help you understand the key, most important stuff you should be looking for. That's really important stuff to be looking for when you're taking notes, too. So, how do an organism's adaptations help it to survive? What are the major types of interactions among organisms? And what are the three forms of symbiotic relationships? These are things that the book says are really important and therefore probably are pretty important. All right, let's get started. I'll start reading over here. Just a note, if you're taking notes on this as we read, often chapters or sections within a chapter start with what I call a fluffy story. So think if you can identify it right off the bat. Imagine giving a big hug to the plant in the photo. Ouch. The sharp spines on its trunk would make you think twice before hugging or even touching the saguaro cactus. Are you catching on? That's obviously not something to take a note on, right? It's just setting the scene. Okay. But if you could spend a day hidden inside a saguaro, you would see that many species do interact with this spiky plant. As the day breaks, you hear a twittering noise coming from a nest tucked in one of the saguaro's arms. Two young red-tailed hawks are preparing to fly for the first time. Farther down the trunk, a tiny elf owl peeks out of its nest in a small hole. The elf owl is so small it could fit in your palm. A rattlesnake slithers around the base of the saguaro, looking for lunch. Spying a nearby shrew, the snake moves in for the kill. With a sudden movement, it strikes the shrew with its sharp fangs. The activity around the saguaro doesn't stop after the sun goes down. At night, long-nosed bats feed on the nectar from the saguaro's blossoms. They stick their faces into the flowers to feed, covering their long snouts with a dusting of white pollen in the process. As the bats move from plant to plant, they carry the pollen along. This enables the cactuses to reproduce. So basically, this fluff story is trying to tell you that even in such a small little environment as just around this saguaro cactus, a lot of organisms are interacting and they sort of make an impact on each other. Adapting to the environment. Each organism in this desert ecosystem has some unique characteristics. In response to their environments, species evolve or change over time. The changes that make organisms better suited to their environments develop through a process called natural selection. Natural selection works like this. Individuals in a population have different characteristics. Those individuals whose characteristics are best suited for their environment tend to survive and produce offspring. Offspring that inherit the characteristics that made their parents successful also live to reproduce. Over many generations, individuals with those characteristics continue to reproduce. Individuals that are poorly suited to the environment are less likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, these poorly suited characteristics may disappear from the population. This process results in adaptations, the behaviors and physical characteristics of species that allow them to live successfully in their environment. So remember, if you're taking notes, anytime you come across a bold word, those are probably important things to note down. Every organism has a variety of adaptations that are suited to its specific living conditions. The adaptations of the organisms in the desert ecosystem create unique roles for each organism. An organism's particular role, or how it makes a living, basically how it fits into its environment, is called its niche. Some people say niche. A niche includes the type of food the organism eats, how it obtains this food, and what other species use the organism for food. The niche also includes when and how the organism reproduces and the physical conditions it requires to survive. An organism's niche may include how it interacts with other organisms. During your day in the saguaro community, you observed a range of such interactions. There are three major types of interactions among organisms: competition, predation, and symbiosis. So remember, this was one of the guided reading questions. So they've bolded it here. So there are 2 hints. This is a pretty important thing to write down. Checking out these pictures in the PDF online would probably be helpful too. I'm going to keep going though. We'll come back to this one up here in a minute. Competition. Different species can share the same habitat, such as the many animals that live in and around the saguaro. Different species can also share similar food requirements. For example, the red-tailed hawk and the elf owl both live on the saguaro and eat similar food. However, these 2 species do not occupy exactly the same niche. The hawk is active during the day, while the owl is mostly active at night. If 2 species occupy the same niche, one of the species will eventually die off. The reason for this is competition, the struggle between organisms to survive in a habitat with limited resources. An ecosystem cannot satisfy the needs of all the living things in a particular habitat. There is a limited amount of food, water, and shelter. Organisms that survive have adaptations that enable them to reduce competition. For example, the 3 species of warblers in Figure 12, we'll look at it in a second, live in the same spruce forest habitat. They all eat insects that live in the spruce trees. How do these birds avoid competing for the limited insect supply? Each warbler specializes in feeding in a certain part of the spruce tree. By finding their own places to feed, the 3 species can coexist. So let's go take a look real quick up here. So each of these different types of warblers feed at different levels of the tree. So the Cape May warbler feeds at the very top, and the bay-breasted warbler feeds here in the middle. And the yellow-rumped warbler feeds in the lower part of the tree and at the bases of the middle branches. So here, all the way down to the bottom. So that's how they avoid competition. Many plants use chemicals to ward off their competition. Plants often compete with one another for growing space and water. Some shrubs release toxic or poisonous chemicals into the ground around them. These chemicals keep grass and weeds from growing around the shrubs, sometimes forming a ring of bare ground 1 meter or 2 wide. It's really interesting. Okay, predation. A tiger shark lurks beneath the surface of the clear blue water, looking for shadows of young albatross floating above it. The shark sees a chick and silently swims closer. Suddenly, the shark bursts through the water and seizes the albatross with one snap of its powerful jaw. This interaction between 2 organisms has an unfortunate ending for the albatross. An interaction in which one organism kills and eats another is called predation. The organism that does the killing, the hunter, which in this case is the tiger shark, is called the predator. The organism that is killed, the albatross in this example, is the prey. Predator adaptations. Predators have adaptations that help them catch and kill their prey. For example, a cheetah can run very fast for a short time, enabling it to catch its prey. A jellyfish's tentacles contain a poisonous substance that paralyzes tiny water animals. Tiny water animals. By the way, side note, we don't call them jellyfish anymore. They're actually called jellies because they're not technically a fish. That was probably a bit science nerdy of me. I'm sorry. You can probably think of many predators that have claws, sharp teeth, or stingers. Some plants too have adaptations for catching prey. The sundew is covered with sticky bulbs on stalks. When a fly lands on the plant, it remains snared in the sticky goo while the plant digests it. Some predators have adaptations that enable them to hunt at night. For example, the big eyes of an owl let in as much light as possible to help it see in the dark. Bats can hunt without seeing at all. Instead, they locate their prey by producing pulses of sound and listening for the echoes. This precise method enables a bat to catch a flying moth in complete darkness. Let's go up here for a second. Here are some examples of prey adaptations, so adaptations that help organisms avoid becoming eaten, basically. Camouflage, right? These organisms look just like the branches they live on. A sea urchin has all of these spikes. Same thing with porcupines, hedgehogs, cactuses, things like that. Okay, let's keep reading. Prey adaptations. How do prey organisms manage to avoid being killed by such effective predators? In exploring defense strategies, what we just looked at above and here below, you can see some examples of how organisms' physical characteristics can help protect it. So we just saw a few before. Some frogs have warning coloring. So this frog is very bright, which you can't see. I think it's a bright reddish orange. It says right here, the bright red and blue of this poison arrow frog warn predators not to eat it. Glands on the frog's back release toxic chemicals that make it a bad choice for a meal. Mimicry. If you've ever been stung by a bee, you'd probably keep your distance from this insect, but actually this bee, quote, quote, is a harmless fly. The fly's resemblance to a stinging bee protects it from birds and other predators who are fooled into staying away. Tricky. This one also has some false coloring. So which way is this butterfly fish swimming? On the back dot on its tail is a false eye, so it could make it look like it's swimming in that direction to a predator. A predator may bite this end of the fish, allowing it to escape with only part of its tail missing, which it can keep on living without that. This is interesting. Maybe we can come back to this in a minute. All right, the effect of predation on population size. Predation can have a major effect on the size of a population. As you learned in Section 2, when the death rate exceeds the birth rate in a population, the size of the population usually decreases. Obviously, you didn't read Section 2, so you didn't know that, but it makes sense. If more are dying than are being born, then the population is probably going to get smaller. If predators are very effective at hunting their prey, the result is often a decrease in the size of the prey population. But a decrease in the prey population in turn affects the predator population. Think about it. If there's not enough food, then that's going to hurt the predators. To see how predators and prey populations can affect each other, look at the graph above. The graph shows the number of moose and wolves living on Isle Royale, an island in Lake Superior. From 1965 to 1975, the number of prey moose increased. The wolves now had enough to eat, so more of them survived. Within a few years, the wolf population began to increase. The growing number of wolves killed more and more moose. The moose population decreased. By 1980, the lack of moose had greatly affected the wolves. Some wolves starved, and others could not raise as many young. Soon the moose population began to climb again. This cycle for the two species has continued. So let's take a look. You can see here, so this one is the moose population, and this one is the wolf population. And basically, they're opposites of each other, right? When the wolf population is high, the moose population is low, and then they switch. The moose population grows, and the wolves become less, right? So if there are a lot of wolves, they're killing all the moose to eat, and they're better able to survive. But then there are fewer moose, right? And if they're... Oh, I think I'm doing that backwards. No, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm right. I'm getting confused because these lines are very similar colored, right? So now, if there aren't enough moose, then the wolves start to die. And if the wolves start to die, then the moose start to become more of the population, right? And so on and so forth. And then if there's a lot of moose, then the wolves can eat them and they grow, right? And then they switch back and forth, back and forth. Seems like something probably happened around here that hurt them both, maybe a drought or something. Okay. Of course, other factors also affect the populations on Isle Royale. For instance, cold winters and disease can also reduce the size of one or both of the populations. Interesting. So maybe there was a really cold winter or some kind of disease that hurt them in that instance that we just looked at. All right. The next one, symbiosis. Many of the interactions in the saguaro community you read about earlier are examples of symbiosis. Symbiosis is a close relationship between two species that benefits at least one of the species. There are three types of symbiotic relationships: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Okay, so that means that at least one of the species is going to benefit from the relationship. Mutualism. A relationship in which both species benefit is called mutualism. Get it? It's mutual. The relationship between the saguaro and the long-eared bats is an example of mutualism. The bat benefits because the cactus flowers provide it with food, and the saguaro benefits as its pollen is carried to another plant on the bat's nose. At this very moment, you are participating in a mutualistic relationship with a population of bacteria in your large intestine, right in your stomach. These bacteria called, oh boy, Escherichia coli, don't quote me on that, live in the intestines of most mammals. They break down some foods that the mammal cannot digest. The bacteria benefit by receiving food and a place to live. You also benefit from the relationship because the bacteria help you digest your food. Your Escherichia coli also provides you with vitamin K, a nutrient that is needed to make your blood clot. That means if you get a cut, eventually it'll stop bleeding. Okay, commensalism. A relationship in which one species benefits and the other species is neither helped nor harmed is called commensalism. So commensalism means one is benefiting and it doesn't matter to the other one at all. The red-tailed hawk's interaction with the saguaro is an example of commensalism. The hawks are helped by having a place to build their nest, while the cactus is not affected by the birds or their nests. Commensalism is not very common in nature because two species are usually either helped or harmed by any little interaction. For example, by creating a small hole for its nest in the cactus trunk, the elf owl slightly damages the cactus. Here's an example of a hippo. These birds kind of hang out on its back. It's not really bothered by that. Right? What does it say here? 3 yellow-billed oxpeckers get a cruise and a snack aboard an obliging hippopotamus. The oxpeckers eat ticks living on the hippo's skin. Oh, here we go. Since both the birds and the hippo benefit from this interaction, it is an example of actually mutualism. Because the hippo is getting the ticks eaten and they're getting food from that. Kind of gross, but true. All right, parasitism. The third type of symbiosis is called parasitism. Parasitism involves one organism living on or inside another organism and harming it. The organism that benefits is called a parasite, and the organism it lives on or in is called a host. The parasite is usually smaller than the host. In a parasitic relationship, the parasite benefits from the interaction while the host is harmed. They're hurt. Some common parasites you may be familiar with are fleas, ticks, and leeches. These parasites have adaptations that enable them to attach to their host and feed on its blood. Other parasites live inside the host body, such as tapeworms that live inside the digestive systems of dogs and wolves. Unlike a predator, a parasite does not usually kill the organism it feeds on. If the host dies, the parasite loses its source of food. An interesting example of this rule is shown by a species of mite that lives in the ears of moths. The mites almost always live in just one of the moth's ears. If they live in both ears, the moth's hearing is so badly affected that it is likely to be quickly caught and eaten by its predator, a bat. All right. Let's move right along to this about not all bones are equal. This rainbow trout doesn't need strong bones because the water supports its weight. Let's read. Fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly. That's a line from an old song, and it sounds true, doesn't it? After all, fish come equipped for swimming and birds are built for flying. What else would they do? But some fish live on shore, some birds walk, and some four-footed mammals swim or even fly. They've managed to make bodies built for one way of life work in another. That's a confusing sentence. They managed to make bodies built for one way of life work in another. So basically they're saying, birds can walk, humans can swim, even though we live on land, right? Fish, birds, and mammals have bodies designed for specific purposes. They're all vertebrates, animals with backbones. So if you see in an article like this them defining a word, it's probably worth writing it down. They all have heads, brains, eyes, skeletons, and similar sets of internal organs, but those basic parts can be very different. Consider, for example, fish bones. They're thin and fairly bendy, and really annoying when you try to pick them out of your supper, if you've ever even done that. They can afford to be relatively weak because they don't have to support the fish's weight. Water takes care of that. The fish simply floats underwater, propelling itself by flexing powerful muscles along its sides. Chicken bones aren't nearly as annoying on your dinner plate as fish bones. They're bigger and easier to see, and they don't bend. That's because a chicken isn't held up by the water. Instead, it has a skeleton of rigid bones to support its body. But weigh the chicken bone in your hand. Not very heavy, is it? If you break it open, you'll find that the bone is just a hollow tube with a bit of soft tissue inside. Most birds, even poor flyers like chickens, have lightweight bones to make flying easier. So chickens and birds have hollow bones to try to make flying a little bit easier, make them lighter. Cattle don't fly, so they don't need light bones. Instead, they need bones strong enough to support a heavy animal. If you look inside a steak bone, you'll see that it's solid most of the way through. It doesn't bend, and it doesn't break easily. Fish bones, bird bones, and mammal bones are as different as bones can be, but they suit the lives of most of those animals lead. If a fish, a bird, or a mammal tries to live a different kind of life, it will need to make changes. Sometimes a change in behavior is enough, but other changes go bone deep. Skipping between land and sea. Breathing is no problem for mudskippers, and they also get around fine on land. These little fish, most no longer than your hand, skitter around the warm, muddy shorelines of oceans bordering Africa, Asia, and Australia. They have googly eyes, big mouths, and look a bit like cartoon fish. This is one of them. Mudskippers have adapted so well to the world of air that they spend most of their time out of water. They dip into shallow pools to avoid drying out and dart into air-filled burrows at the first sign of trouble. As their name suggests, mudskippers hop nimbly across boot-swallowing mud at low tide, using their tails and a muscular set of fins that look remarkably like front legs. Their fins are so strong that mudskippers can clamber over mangrove tree roots or even climb them to avoid the oncoming tide. Wait, what's a fish doing hiding from the tide in a tree? It happens to be a safe place to hide from predatory fish that come in with the tides, and mudskippers are quite content in a tree. They have gills that absorb oxygen from water, but they can also breathe air through special oxygen-transferring cells in their gills and through their skin, as long as it stays moist. Most fish have eyes designed to see underwater, but the mudskipper has solved that problem too. Its bulgy eyes stick up from the top of its head, more like frog eyes than fish eyes. To keep the eyes moist, skin folds beneath each eye form cups that hold water. When its eyes start to dry out, the mudskipper retracts them quickly into the cups to moisten them, then slides them back into place. Basically blinks. Mudskippers have also figured out what to do with the kids, or in fish terms, the eggs. Fish normally lay eggs in water, but mudskippers aren't normal fish. First, the male mudskipper uses his fins to dig out a large chamber in his burrow. Then he sets out to entice a female to join him, sometimes with a sort of dance that involves puffing out his cheeks, arching his back, and even flipping his body into the air. If a female is suitably impressed, she wriggles into the burrow and deposits her eggs on the roof and upper walls of the chamber. In some species, both parents care for the eggs, and in others, only the male does. Egg care includes guarding the burrow and keeping it full of fresh air. While the tide is low, mudskippers carry fresh oxygen-filled air into the burrow in their mouths so that both the parent fish and the eggs they guard can wait out the high tide in comfort.